Just moving away from the testing and back to the maturation stuff.
Yeah.
Been early or late maturer, how does that affect experiences and development in track and field from your experiences based on the track and field role that you've got?
Yeah. I mean, in a physically dominant sport like track and field, it appears to have a pretty huge influence, particularly in this youth age bracket between 13 and 15, where the maturational differences are at their greatest. You've got kids that have gone through early, and you've got kids that are, delayed in that process. And maturing early gives the gift of speed, strength, and power when and the late developers are just left behind. And then when you do that in a track and field setting with some particularly talented boys that mature early, the gulf is huge. And the danger with it is you overlook the potential, really, really long-term potential talent because of what you're seeing in those outcome metrics, time and distance. And, if you have a coaching team that don't understand that all of these things are going to level out by 16 to 18 when everyone's fully mature, like, you can lose people from the pathway because maybe they don't get the same level of support as people that are perceived to be, more talented, or they don't get selected in the first place. And this is what we're trying to work towards with some of our talent ID and pre-academy, is keeping people in the pathway for long enough to see what they're really capable of. That's a big thing for us. But yeah, I think biobanding and understanding growth and maturation just have huge applications in a sport like track and field. When you're looking at a sport like football, obviously physical attributes have a lot of impact, but there's also the skill component that levels the playing field to a certain extent. And skill doesn't level the playing field to the same extent in a sport like athletics, because it is driven by those physical characteristics that we've talked about. And I think, if you look at like an early developer in track and field, winning comes easy. When they mature above everybody else, they win easy. They come then potentially with an overinflated perception of their ability. But then if that's not handled and they're not challenged in the right way, and they're not forced to kind of race people of a similar level as them, then they struggle when everybody else does catch up because they've never lost. But I think it also can make them a little bit sloppy and lazy in terms of the technical side, because they don't have to work as hard at that stuff and to win. They just turn up and get in the blocks and pow, they're gone. We had one kid, early maturer, came in at grade 8, immediately looked at some of the physical testing, and he was already putting out 70 to 80 watts per kilo at 13. We're talking about elite sprinters needing to put out 80 watts and above within like the EIS system. This kid was absolute horsepower machine, like he just could put out. So smashed everybody in development, like all the time. Long jump, sprint, whatever it was, he turned his hand to. Like, he was just more powerful than anybody else, and no one else could keep up. But yeah, now he's kind of found his level with the performance group. It's been a lot more challenging for him to deal with that psychologically. And yeah, just seeing, where other boys have really mastered the craft from a technical perspective, there's things that are big work-ons for him. And then the other aspect is then the kind of injuries that come when they've got that horsepower and not the technical efficiency. So we're having some challenges in that respect with the early maturers. But then, if you look at on the other side of the coin with the late developer, for them, winning in an age bracket is almost impossible. what they're going to, what is their experience of track and field? If you turned up to the track every week and you knew you were just going to get absolutely pumped because these boys are bigger, stronger, and faster than you, are you going to stay in the sport, or are you going to go and find something else? And that's the bit. That's the big thing. So it's like how that's where I think something like biobanding has such a big role to play in a sport like this, because it can really alter the experiences for both early and late developers. You've got the guys in between who are just kind of, they're there or thereabouts, they're competitive, but the extremes I think are really interesting to deal with, both in terms of providing an appropriate challenge and for the early developer, and making sure that they develop the skills and psychological characteristics to be able to cope later on. But then the later guys, keeping them engaged long enough that we actually get to see their true potential, and they don't just go and disappear into another sport because they can have a bit more success there. So I think those late developers, there's definitely they don't appreciate what their true future potential is, and I think there's a risk that the coaches don't either. But that's where, when we can start to evaluate their physical qualities against like the maturation benchmarks, we can say, hold on, like this kid's pre-PHV or approaching PHV, but he's 2 standard deviations above like the average performances in all our tests. He's still slower than everybody else, but against like boys that have come through at a similar maturation status, like we can see that this kid has maybe a lot of future potential, but we're not seeing it on the track or in the circle right now. We need, we just need to, this kid does look good, but we need to see how he's going to develop. And that then, comes down to conversations with the coaching team and parents and everything else. It's like, this is a kid we need to keep in. And we've got a couple of examples of those kind of guys in the pathway now that we've managed to keep in, which I see as a big kind of win.
I can definitely appreciate all of that, because as a tall kid playing football, never used to have to jump. Always just used to head it. And then you get a little bit older, people start to, or you get a bigger lad, or the late maturer becomes a bigger lad, and you're like, I have to jump now. That's not as easy to get into the groove of actually having to jump and compete, having 5 years of just like, it just drops on your head and away it goes. I can appreciate all of that. Yeah. But just going to, you've got a couple of case studies that you were going to run through. I've got them on screen here, but I'd love you to dive into some of the detail of kind of extreme examples of early and late maturers.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this was something that when we unpacked it, we were just like, wow, this really does emphasize the differences of what it could be, in terms of kids within the same chronological age groups of 2 boys. One was 14.3 years, one was 14.9 years. So they compete in the same age category. And then when we look at their 60 meter and long jump results, first athlete, who's the later developer, 60 meter PB of 9.14 seconds. Athlete B, who's the early developer, ran 7.4 seconds for the 60. So, 1 3/4 seconds faster. In the long jump, the late developer jumps 4 meters. The early developer jumps nearly 6 meters, 5.98 meters. So
that's crazy.
I guess it's crazy. Yeah. So if you're then the coach and you don't have any awareness of maturation status of the athlete, when you're asked who has the most talent and who are you going to select to come on camp, who do you think's got the potential for the future, who do you pick? If you're not aware of those things, you're picking the guy that's jumping nearly 6 meters and running under 7.5 seconds for the 60. So, and then when you think of that kid, the late developer, he's almost 2 seconds and 2 meters behind the other kid. Again, what's his experience of athletics at that point in time, being in that environment with him? if he doesn't understand the maturation process and his parents don't understand the maturation process, like he's just, they're like, I'm no good. But we've had conversations with the boy and parents, and they kind of understand where he's at. We've got all of the measures and the metrics around him to say, like, look, he's just not in the same place as this guy. And it's more than how can we keep him interested in the sport, exploring different events, some that are more technically orientated, things like pole vault or hurdles, and things that have more of a skill component that aren't just so raw physical, in nature, like the flat sprint. But yeah, I mean, when you get under the hood, so to speak, and look at the difference between these two boys, it's just, although they're 14.3 and 14.9, approximately 6 months apart, a little bit more. When we looked at the percentages of predicted adult height, athlete A was only 88% of his predicted adult height, and athlete B was 99%. So we've got a boy that's approaching PHV and a boy that's very much post PHV and basically almost fully grown in a skeletal age and height sense. Athlete A, 150 centimeters approximately and about 31 kilos. Athlete B, 165 centimeters and 64 kilos. And then when we looked at the testosterone levels, like athlete B had 6 times the testosterone when he was sampled. And then when we dive deeper into like the physical testing, we looked at strength with the isometric leg press. Athlete A, 2,200 newtons. Athlete B, 6,500 newtons. 10 times the body weight. This kid is very, very genetically gifted. And the other kid, he was still putting out 6 times body weight, 5 to 6 times body weight, because he's only 30 kilos. So, he's still got some good relative strength characteristics. There's other boys, that are his kind of development that are only putting out 2 times body weight. So is that an indication of his future potential to put out something like 7, 8, 9 tons body weight? Maybe. We don't understand how it develops fully yet. Then when you look at the jump metrics, athlete A, 31 centimeter jump, athlete B, 50 centimeter jump. 80 watts per kilo versus 45 to 50 watts per kilo for the late developer. And then, maximal velocity in the 50 meter sprint, 2 meters per second difference, 7.6 versus 9.6 meters per second. An interesting thing, like I kind of mentioned before around like the 10.5 is like both of them had similar RSI levels, but when you unpack how they did it, the one guy jumped 45 centimeters off 180 millisecond ground contact time. He was the early developer, and then the late developer, he jumps just under 31 centimeters off 150 contact time. So you can, and athlete B is definitely a concentric guy. He's a pusher. He's gonna really excel in acceleration, and he excels in these concentric tasks like counter movement jump. This other guy, I think he's probably going to come out a bit more elastic. He's not got that maybe the same kind of absolute force output, but he's gonna do things a little bit differently, and he's one of the guys. Maybe we'll be seeing at Doha 2030. Who knows? When we really see him kind of come through. But we're watching him carefully at the moment, and how things are changing, and we can see through some of our maturation stuff, the time is coming very late in the day for PHV, but it's happening. So we'll be excited to see in the next couple of years what he kind of becomes and what those metrics kind of look like as that happens. But again, he's someone, when you look at all of those scores compared to like the early developer, they pale in comparison. But when you look at all those metrics in the context of other kids at the same stage of maturation, so approaching PHV, like he's 1 to 2 standard deviations above the average in all the results, pretty much. So that's why we're able to then say, okay, this kid's got something. We just need to make sure we give him enough time to realize it and don't lose him along the way.
Let's have a little chat around the training aspect of the physical capabilities that you're wanting to develop to ensure that these guys and girls develop and excel. Can you have a little dive into that and the training skills and the physical capabilities that you need to develop and how you're doing that?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what I alluded to earlier on, in that there's the training skills are pretty consistent of what we need to develop these high levels that we're talking about here, high levels of relative power, relative strength, reactive strength, and speed. There's a toolbox that, again, doesn't really change year on year, aside from maybe some new fancy equipment coming out that we all go clamoring after. I listened to Angus Ross's podcast the other day, and I was like, oh, I want one of those passive squatting machines. Go buy one of those. YouTubing that now. But I guess training skills, if we're going to develop high levels of relative strength, we've got to develop a high skill level in the strength exercises that we need to do that. And that's kind of the job of the foundation and development phases, is to groove the patterns against body weight, layer in then the volume and complexity before we give the training, introduce the more advanced barbell, dumbbell, externally loaded work. But if the patterns are grooved early on, like that process is fairly straightforward. We've got a little bit of ironing out some creases to do around PHV when they grow rapidly. But those strength movements that we all know, and I guess the holy grail: squatting, pushing, lunging, pulling, bracing, rotating, getting those to a really decent level by the time they're sort of in the latter stages of the development phase, that we can then hit the higher relative strength levels in the performance phase that enables them to perform at a high level. Olympic lifting is something which is a big part of our pathway. I know there's a lot of people who kind of say, oh, it takes too long to teach, it's not worthwhile, blah, blah, blah. But, for us, I don't agree. I think 1 or 2 exercises in a program, in warm-ups from, very early on, these kids can be pretty proficient without a massive time investment week to week. And something that I try and do within the development phase, take a very balanced approach to physical development, and make sure that we're not overemphasizing strength, we're not overemphasizing the development of Olympic lifting. We make sure that we've got time for our plyometric work and the aspects that we need to make sure that they're robust enough for, to tolerate the demands of training for the sport. So Olympic lifting will be a big part of it in terms of training skills. We use ballistic exercises, obviously medicine ball throws at the lower level, but that will transition to loaded jumping, squat jump, jump squat, with and without counter movements, and that will transition into some stuff with barbells or Smith machine, and we'll progressively, I guess, load that over a period of 2 to 3 years, from medicine balls to dumbbells, gradually heavier dumbbells, up to a point where they start working with a 30 kilo trap bar and a 20 kilo squat jump, and we'll just start to let the kids get after moving those things fast and getting some objective feedback on the gym aware or equivalent device. And then I think the big thing for us, and something that is a consistent theme through the whole thing, is the progressive plyometric scheme, and making sure that these kids are developing elastic qualities that we can't really get from if we just hammer strength training and Olympic lifting, and we miss plyometrics, then we're not developing those reactive strength qualities that are going to enable them to be successful in some of these speed power events, particularly sprinting and jumping. But it's about, again, like everything else, taking a very gradual and progressive approach to how we expose them to the level of eccentric load and the complexity of those exercises. over time that's kind of key. But it's something that's a constant in our programs. It's a little bit of dovetailing with the track coaches and working closely with them to make sure that, you know, some track coaches like to take that on and have it as part of their track sessions, because there's, you know, compatible elements between some of the vertical and horizontal plyometrics and, you know, upright running and acceleration respectively. But there's others who kind of want that in the particularly the vertical element in the gym component with, you know, with me. So it just depends, and we just look at how that kind of volume and intensity looks across the week and across the year, and, you know, do a lot of work progressing from softer surfaces and sand to grass to track, and that's it's a big part of our kind of lower leg preparation for when they hit the track in spikes later on, as well as, you know, the improvements in reactive or elastic strength, however you like to term it, for the actual event performance as well.
One thing that I wanted to put to you, and this was, I'm sure this comes up with people all the time. You've got the group of kids, group of athletes, and you're pulling them all up relatively similarly, although they're at different levels. Everyone's kind of moving up. And then you'll get a spanner in the works, and someone will come in who's either way above these guys or but more often than not, a beginner with strength training or any type of athletic development. How are you juggling that? And I'm guessing there's people out there listening. Well, I know there'll be people out there listening going, yep, got one right now. How do you juggle that? How do you pull that guy up alongside the rest of them and do your best to kind of get them on par as quickly as possible?
I think when you've got, like you say, we've got a curriculum that we want to work to, but there is always those guys that join late, and it's definitely something that gets asked when I talk about this pathway kind of concept. It's like, well, what happens when they miss the first part of the pathway? So yes, it's a challenge when it comes in. But I mean, for me, how I kind of handle it is get them in, and let's do a diagnostic session, and that's nothing fancy. It's like if from a teaching, again, go back to the teaching world, you have different forms of assessment that you kind of use. Diagnostic assessment is where you kind of you do a set of tasks or a lesson where you're just watching and you're observing what are they like, what can they do, and that then helps you form your plan. Then you have formative assessment, which is kind of like your assessment along the way, and you're making your judgments and assessments and tweaking. And then, you know, your summative type assessments are your testing, your competition, or whatever else. But those things for me aren't necessarily what I would do immediately. It's the diagnostic session and discussing with the athlete, you know, what is their previous training experience, you know, as much as you can trust that from, you know, a young athlete that maybe isn't 100% clear on exactly what it was they were being asked to do, you know, previous injuries. And then that diagnostic session is just a very basic session, which probably from, if I'm looking at all my pathway pieces, it's like a foundation level program that I look at how they move in those basic movements, squatting, lunging, pushing, bracing. You know, can they hold a plank for 30 seconds? Can they do a lunge without falling over? Can they squat through full range of movement? Can they do a press up without, you know, their hips collapsing and, you know, they can get through a full range, or can they not? And if they haven't, then right, well, if they smash through that, okay, well, we can maybe give them a couple of weeks of volume in those type of exercises and progress the complexity, but then we're going to get into, you know, more of a development type program, which is, you know, introducing low external load and progressing gradually. But if they can't, then it's a case of, well, they're going to be on a differentiated program. If you've got someone, we've had a number of kids that kind of coming in the development phase, and they don't have the movement competency to pick up a barbell or a dumbbell. So they're in the same session, but they're on a foundation kind of program to build those basics. Now, what happens a lot of the time is, particularly when they come in later, is they're more mature. So they don't take a long time to tick off all the boxes in terms of your kind of objectives and outcomes from a foundation phase. like from the curriculum, we kind of have flexible, objective-based system. It's not hard and fast like session plans and lessons. It's like, right, these are the objectives and outcomes. Can you meet those? Okay, well, you know, a kid that's mature that comes in the development phase will probably check off those things in 6 to 8 weeks, and it serves almost like a GPP type program, general preparation. You know, make sure they're robust enough. You know, okay, by the end of 6 weeks, they can probably hold a plank for 2 minutes. You know, do some goblet squats with, you know, 15 to 20 kilos, and then they're ready to transition to, you know, a front squat 20 kilos. You know, those transition points just become fairly kind of natural. A foundation program with a kid who's not mature might take them a year to kind of check off all those boxes. So when they come later, it's just accepting that those, or expecting them to get through that stuff faster. You know, they only need, you know, and if you take a kid at 14 or 15, it might take them six to 8 weeks to check off all those competencies. You know, they come in at older, again, it might be 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even less. Like, oh yeah, I've done a bit of training. Okay, well, we're going to have a look at you anyway through these basic things. How do you respond? You know, do they do a little bit of work, and you know they've got DOMs for the next 6 weeks and don't want to train. So you know, it's kind of managing those things as well. It's like, okay, I know you're stronger, but we need to just make sure that you know you can tolerate the work that we're going to do, not throw you in the deep end and then you can't sprint or throw for a few weeks just because you're so sore, and then the coach is pissed off. So managing that part of it, and you know, you have to kind of hold the reins in on some of them a little bit, particularly when you get these kids in that are speed power athletes, that you could very quickly, you know, get these guys up to speed, but at what cost, you know, in terms of like the other training aspects, like the sprinting and stuff. Like they'll probably chuck plenty of weight on, you know, quickly, and they do it, but do they tolerate it well? Probably, you know, probably not. But you know, you can see that they want to do what the other boys are doing because they can see the lads around them shifting a bit of tin, and that, you know, that kind of frustrates them. But I guess education process around that, and you know, it's then like looking at once they've had a bit of training, get them in to do a bit of testing as well, and look at those kind of characteristics that we know are required for success. And you know, we had a new athlete coming at the sprint phase this year, started out with Ross, and you know, straight away we could see he's got the raw power capabilities, lots of potential, but big gaps in his development as well, like in terms of training skills and other qualities. So in terms of raw power in like a counter movement jump, awesome. Reactive strength, not good. No exposure to like plyometrics or anything like that, you know. Weak through his core in terms of just controlling plank positions and things like that. So, you know, for him, back to basics in terms of the program, 16, 17, but, you know, doing some core work just to get that key area from a robustness perspective up together. You know, introducing some basic plyometric skills, pogo jumps, learning to be fast off the ground. Probably, you know, it won't be something that he'll ever excel at based on how late he's getting exposed to it. But, you know, he will make improvements from where he's at. That is for sure. And then putting in place all the strength training skills, learning to Olympic lift. That's proving an interesting task at the moment, but you know, we'll just look at loaded jumps as a primary power stimulus for him whilst, you know, he's still learning those components, and then checking off robustness in all those other areas as well. So yeah, and I guess another thing that kind of plays into it when an athlete joins late is, you know, what time frames are we dealing with until we need to see a performance, or that athlete needs a performance of a certain level. So, you know, if you get a kid in who's 15, 16, but, you know, in a football academy or whatever, he's got to perform and get a contract by the time he leaves under 16, then, or under 17, then, you know, maybe to do that kid justice, you've got to push the performance measures a little bit harder than than you would if you can't slow cook him or he's missed his chance.
Yeah.
You've still got to try and have aspects of your program where you're checking off like the LTAD objectives, but you've also got to be realistic. Like, this is this kid's one chance, and if you take 3 years to get him to, a decent level of fitness, he's in the non-leagues. It could be in the higher leagues. So I think, you have to keep those kind of things in mind as well. You're not always blessed with, lots and lots of time when they join the pathway later, and it's looking at, you've still got to do things that are, effective, but and safe, but you maybe need to get a physical stimulus a different way. For this guy, it could be, maybe we end up using the leg press as his primary strength stimulus to get after the neuromuscular adaptations we want, rather than waiting until the back squat is, up to a skill level where we can really load it. We're probably going to find things earlier that we can do that with, and still, we'll see positive changes on the track. We've seen this, we try to not be tied to specific exercises and things. We're driving more around, what adaptation do we want and how can we get it with this person, and I think, kind of breaks away from the whole kind of curriculum aspect at that point where performance is the goal, and it becomes a more individual kind of process. But yeah, that's kind of how we would, I guess, approach it with those late joiners.
We've spoke about the more event-specific groups, specifically the track athletes. Yeah. In our previous episode, we spoke about more the development groups. How do they? One final question I've got for you, although it might be quite a big one. How different are they? What is different, and how do you manage both? Yeah.
So, I mean, the main difference between the development program and the event-specific program is that the development guys are learning the sport, and they are learning a broad range of events, multi-events, to then specialize at a later stage. We don't want them specializing too early. Kids that come in thinking they're a sprinter at 11, and then they need a broad experience that develops a range of skills, but also means that they're not, getting overused injuries by these repetitive actions associated with one event. So the performance level groups, it's more specialized training towards a broader event group. It's not like you're just a 60 guy or a 100 guy. They'll participate like still within a range of events within that group, particularly in the first year or so where they're just transitioning. But it kind of moves away from, I described it a little bit earlier as a flexible objective-based system where we're trying to check off all these training skills and filling the buckets of the different physical capacities up to a certain level. And then it moves away from this curriculum framework to a more traditional periodized approach and meeting the demands of the sport and addressing the individual needs of the athlete. And then that more traditional periodized year from a track perspective will be GPP, SPP, indoor competition, go on camp, have another specific prep phase, and then into the outdoor season. Like for our senior guys, that will be kind of how it flows. Whereas the development program, those guys won't have such a high frequency of athletics. The youngest guys will probably only have one S&C session, but they'll have gymnastics, parkour type activities. They'll do multi-sport, which will include swimming, volleyball, basketball, cycling around the kind of Aspire Park area. They have a real wide range of activities that they participate in. And it's not to say the older boys don't still do some of those things from time to time, but it's more focused on, right, what we're trying to achieve. Well, we're trying to qualify for World Youth Olympics, or World Under 20s, or something on a more regional level. So those are kind of like, I guess, bigger differences. And like I said, the emphasis the emphasis is less on kind of checking off boxes and making sure these capacities and skills are in place and meeting the demands. And from the sprint group perspective, we look at where the injuries are predominantly in the lower body. We look at the more focused approach. This year we've taken to kind of monitoring trunk, calf, hamstring, adductors, making sure that those things are taken care of in terms of basic some basic testing, and check that off along the way, and then get after the high levels of relative strength and power. As I said, building on that work that's been done in development and try to maximize those qualities. And like I mentioned, it's clearer what you're dealing with in terms of the type of the athlete, and biasing their training a little bit more towards their strengths at key times of the year, enabling them to perform, I guess, at their maximum.
One thing that's come up in conversation quite a few times, James, is velocity-based training, and I think it's something it sounds great. And this is something I mentioned on the mastermind we did with John O'Weekly and Lachlan and Dan Baker. It sounds absolutely incredible. You read the research, you read John O's work, you read anyone's work, and you're like, okay, this no-brainer. But actual integration of that tech into an environment, especially in an environment with youth athletes, how hard has that been? Do you do it at all, or do you do it at certain times of the year with certain lifts, with certain boys or girls? What's your thoughts?
I use it. Yeah, I do use it, and I use it pretty frequently, particularly with the older groups. I introduced it to the development group at one point this year, the older development group, development 3, sort of 15, 16, because I want them to be familiar with it before they come to performance. So, as well as having kind of like these training skill boxes we want to tick, we also want them to be familiar with some of the technology and the testing that we're going to use higher up. So I picked out like 4 of the boys to kind of pilot the VBT with, and it was just a gym aware on a Smith machine jump squat, 20 kilos. They'd been doing dumbbell jumping with 10 kilos in each hand for a while. So I was like, okay, we'll just give them a bit of this. So I introduced it to this group, and this was a larger group, 10 to 12 athletes. Give it to 4 of the older, more mature boys. Absolutely decimated the session, because the other 8 kids also wanted to see what that was about, and we struggled to get them back on track. They loved it. They all ended up like trying to have a go on it. I had to pull some of them off the machine literally, because it wasn't really appropriate for them. But I think those guys seeing those numbers were like, oh, I like this. I want to get after this. I want to see what I can kind of put out. And I think I like it to educate the kids around. It's not always lifting heavier. We're not going to ask you to keep doing more jump squats with more loads, or some of this is about targeting speed and moving light loads faster, and let's do that week on week and see where we can kind of get to with a 20 kilo bar. And those are the things when you look at like the literature that probably have more transfer to sports like jumping and the jump events and the sprint events, like moving light loads quickly is possibly more important than, whereas with a rugby player, it would be moving heavier loads quickly based on, what they're going to deal with in contact, for example. So I like it from an education perspective on that. But yeah, definitely with like the younger groups, I mean, we've got like 1 or 2 gym awares that we could use it on, but we only got one Smith machine that we were using on that day. So it just created like a massive bottleneck in the session, completely ruined the flow. So actually after that week, I canned it with them and just thought, right, I need to get the session back under control to get the other bits of work done. Then they're not quite ready to kind of have that as part of their session, or we maybe needed to introduce it in a different way, that kind of reflection on organization. But then with the older boys, I do like it on key lifts. Lifts I would typically use it on would be the whatever squat variation the athlete's on, whether it's a front squat or a back squat. I would typically use that, and then we'll look at the thresholds and what intensities are kind of part of that periodized plan. So we spend quite a lot of our time in sort of 70 to 80% with some of the younger sprinters that we just want the bars moving a lot faster. We don't necessarily want them like grinding out maximal work at that point. It kind of save that stimulus to a little bit later. So we use the VBT to just make sure we're in the kind of whatever threshold we want. If it's like 0.5 to 0.6 meters per second, and then we might dip in a little bit into some 0.4 to 0.5 with some of them in like a more max, as we start to introduce a bit of max strength. So we use it to monitor that intensity on some of those key lifts and make sure we've got it where we want in terms of the load on that day. And obviously, if they come in tired off the track, it might be a lighter load that takes them to that sweet spot rather than the heavier load when they come in a little bit fresher. They've been running some 120s or something the night before, and they've really been cooked. Then we will be able to adjust the load accordingly using those velocity measures to make sure that we're not, again, putting too much on them and not getting the stimulus that we want. And then the other thing that we'll monitor on is like the jump squats, or done quite a bit this year the last 2 years with trap bar jumps, where particularly for these concentric guys, and we just have, like I mentioned before, flat loading, or a sort of heavier to lighter loading scheme within the set to potentiate the lighter set, and then keep that in for a block and just see beginning of the block what were the peak velocities on each of those loads, and at the end of the block what were the peak velocities on each of those loads, just aiming to move those light loads faster. And then we'll also targeting strength speed aspect of the force velocity curve with some Olympic lift type derivatives or full lifts if they've got that in that toolbox as well. So we're all across the curve, but that's how we kind of implement the VBT element within those two different groups.
Mm-hmm. I've got one last question for you, and that's around the research that you're doing at Aspire, because I know it's something we've spoke about quite a bit over the years. Maybe not something that you've been either exposed to a lot, but I'd like to get your insight into your research process and what you're diving into, which I think will bookend this episode nicely.
Definitely not something that I was exposed to early on, heavy in the sort of teaching and coaching realms in the kind of early stages of my career. And when I did my dissertation, I looked at like some of the quantitative studies, and I was like, oh my god, I don't even know where to start. I'll just do a qualitative study. let's do that. That fits the way my brain works a lot better. So I think that aspect, a lot, probably the first, I guess, 8-9 years of my career, very much teaching, coaching orientated, with an interest obviously in the data and the numbers. But I think being surrounded by the people that I have been at Aspire for the last 3.5 years, guys like Marco Cardinali, Phil Graham-Smith, my boss Barry Shillabeer, and guys like Kenny McMillan. Like when you show them data, they look at it in a very different way and start to pull it apart and ask you questions like, oh, well, do you know if that test is reliable? Like, well, the literature says so, but they kind of question things at a higher level than what I was getting questioned in, the PE setting. In the PE setting, I was getting challenged on my teaching organization. That was what the observations were about. It was like, oh, your session, did you manage the behavior effectively? That transition could have been smoother. The tempo of the session at that part was really slow. You could have, you probably would have avoided some behavior issues if you'd done that. Just a different type of, I guess, analysis in two very different settings around what you're doing. So, I think being in this environment it's kind of been a natural progression because of those questions and challenges about things that you're trying to implement, and it, it brings with it kind of a higher level of accountability, and that's actually been like a challenge I've enjoyed. So I started out with a project, God, 2 years ago now. It just makes me realize how slow I've been in getting this thing actually written up. But we were looking, again, as part of that improving the testing process. What we'd kind of found was, well, like from discussions with Phil and other people that have been doing testing and development, it's like, look, the drop jump is just really messy with these kids. The skill of drop jumping just isn't there, and it's taken a long time to kind of familiarize them with that test. But so we were really just getting a counter movement jump, a sprint, and a few other sort of field tests. And it was like, we really need something which tells us about RSI, and their abilities in that kind of realm. So kind of went down the route of a bit of a pilot project with the 5 max hops, where contact mat, 5 maximal pogo jumps. But we kind of saw that was a little bit noisy. And then I was like, right, well, I found the 10-5 rebound jump Damien Harper came up with a number of years ago. I was like, okay, maybe this is the one. It looks good, in terms of it's reliable and everything else. And again, it was like I said, yeah, research shows it's reliable. I think we should do this. Oh, but is it reliable in the youth cohort? Okay, let's dig a bit deeper. So kind of start looking at the literature, and we can see it's all older adolescents. The literature is kind of 17 years and up. So we're like, right, well, we can't actually be sure. And then when we looked at the 5 max hops literature, some of which was from Rodri Lloyd, it was like, well, actually the CVs are pretty noisy on that in the literature as well. So we saw that it was noisy when we did it in our setting as well. So can we be sure that the 10-5 isn't just the same? No, we can't. So we kind of set about, that was the first research project that I kind of led on. Fingers crossed, it's about to get published after 2 years of
Nice.
2 years of toing and fromming between ourselves internally. But yeah, what we kind of looked at the reliability of that, and it came out really well. And it's hence why we've continued to now use that test in our battery. But that was the kind of first, I guess, project that I drove, and have we kind of had to adapt the project a little bit from when we decided about looking to get it published. It was like we spoke to a few people, spoke to Paul Reed, who was at Aspetar at the time, and he was like, you're probably not going to get just a reliability study published now. There's enough of them. But have you got enough data to look at that within a growth and maturation slant? I looked at it and like, yeah, we did. So we've kind of turned that into, we've looked at RSI and maturation, and that's something which hopefully I've got to do the last round of revisions this week on that, hopefully. So growth and maturation and RSI and how that kind of developed. And then I guess our future directions and the stuff that we're working on at the moment is a lot of the stuff I've talked about around biobanding and growth and maturation in track and field, and trying to really understand that and examine that in a very rigorous way. We can see there's enough in it that we need to study it in more detail. It's now a case of doing the real detail around that, and looking at those different maturation groups and physical characteristics. Now, how do those things then relate to performance in track and field? What is it that really determines performance, and how can we, evaluate competition using biobands, and how do the competition results, what are the kind of relationships with maturation in different events, and hopefully help, kind of shift the emphasis to people, I guess, utilizing that data and it having a positive impact for kids that are participating in the sport. That's ultimately the kind of aim with it, and making sure that, more kids that do have the potential make it in that sport, and that they're not kind of lost. So yeah, those are the things that we're really gonna dive into now over I guess probably the the next couple of years, maybe longer, based on how long it's taken me to get this 10.5 paper done. But yeah, we've got a good team sort of wrapped around that project. Phil, Marco, Paul, Tom Jones up at Northumbria. So a few things that will come out hopefully before too long on that biobanding stuff, and hopefully be impactful and useful stuff.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for that. It's across the last 2 episodes. It's been a pleasure to chat to you again. And although it's only 18 months since you last spoke, lots has changed. Lots more information coming out. So that's superb. But James, anyone that wants to get in contact with you about the stuff that's going in Aspire, the stuff that you did previously at St. Peter's, whatever it may be, what's the best place for people to get in touch?
I guess probably from a S&C sports science perspective, I'm probably most active on Twitter. I think it's at JamesBaker_8 on there. People can also, we do quite a lot of LTAD based education stuff on the LTAD network, so we're all pretty active on there. If people want to get in touch via the website, ltadnetwork.com, people can hop on there and send us a message, and we can discuss whichever area they're interested in, whether it's school, Aspire, or anything else. That's probably the best places. If people want to drop me an email, james@ltadnetwork.com, drop me an email there, and I'll get back as quick as I can around all other commitments as they are at the moment. So but happy to chat and discuss these things with people that are interested.
Well, thank you very much. Stick around because we'll have a little chat after. But officially, I'll say thank you. We'll no doubt speak very soon, but really appreciate your time. And apologies for the few technical issues along the way. We got there in the end.
No worries. No, appreciate the opportunity to hop back on and have a chat again about what we're doing. Yeah, thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, mate. Speak soon.
Speak to you soon.